this notion that scientific knowledge is, on a pedestal. If you understand how things work, that's what we're trying to achieve. We don't really care about prediction. Prediction is just to utilize it, to make money out of it. I don't agree with that. Nobody says that you have to stick with theories forever. The whole idea of science is that theories evolve and get better. But forgetting about theories and saying, oh, they're useless, it's kind of cool and, Silicon Valley to say that. And I used to be very, it's very nice, but it's not long-term thinking and it's not deep thinking.
This is Brain Inspired.
If you have a machine that can accurately predict something, does that mean that you can explain how the machine works, how the predictions were caused? Likewise, if you can explain how a machine works, does that mean you can use it to make accurate predictions? These are pretty important questions these days in neuroscience and AI, because we have these complicated machines called brains, and we use other machines, vastly less complicated but still complicated, deep learning machines or models, which we use a lot these days to model various brain processes. But if we make a deep learning model that perfectly predicts brain activity, as some studies these days are trending slightly toward, does that mean that we can explain brains, let alone understand them? After my conversation with Uri Hasson last episode about brains as brute force data fitting machines, I started exploring the difference between prediction and explanation, and I reached out to Galit Shmueli, my guest today, because Galit has written clearly about the difference between prediction and explanation and their various uses. And I found her because of her 2010 paper about the difference between predictive and explanatory models and predictive and explanatory power. And you can find her giving talks on this topic online as well. Galit is a data scientist, statistician. Well, actually, she doesn't care which of those you call her. She is a professor at National Tsinghua University in Taiwan, and she's done a lot of work in data mining for business analytics, and she's written multiple textbooks on the subject, among other things, but she has a broad background in all things statistics. So she's not a neuroscientist, and she doesn't work in the AI industry, but she's an expert in modeling, especially as it relates to statistics. And I was curious about what she might think of the prospect of using deep learning to model brains. I did record this a couple weeks ago, so you'll hear me in the very beginning, being the clueless American, ignorant of the coming coronavirus situation. When I spoke with Galit, the start of her semester had been delayed because of COVID. I just checked in with her, and she says she's doing well, and they are having classes, and they're still taking lots of precautions. And she said she's thankful for the super quick and effective response of the government there, hint, hint, and that they are inching closer to normal life. So that's good news. She also mentioned that we both, ironically, probably in retrospect, sound a little too casual about COVID, especially given that our topic is predicting and explaining things during this episode. Anyway, don't worry, I'm not going to do a coronavirus special episode, just like every other podcast, it seems, so you're welcome for that. But I do hope that you are well. Oh, and Azat, Esan, Connor, and Bruce, thank you for your support on Patreon. I got a little delayed myself creating the first bits of the Brain Inspired course, but it is coming, and you guys and the rest of my Patreon supporters will see those first bits soon, with more to come later. Learn more about Galit and her work in the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/64, or you can follow her on Twitter. She's at gshmueli. I hope your models are working well out there, whether they're predicting or explaining things. All right, here's Galit. So it's 7:30 p.m. on a Friday here in Colorado. It is 10:30 a.m. Saturday morning there in Taipei. Galit, thanks for being on the show. What's the future like?
I guess when you have these black swans, like coronavirus, you stop forecasting very far ahead. So
I didn't even think about
That's
the coronavirus.
everywhere around us. Yes.
It
yes.
must. Oh man, are you sequestered in your home or what?
Well, I think it's, like a lot of things, it's blown a lot more out of what it really is. But
Yeah.
Our semester starts on Monday, so I'll be more knowledgeable to tell you how crazy things are in a few days.
So it has been delayed then.
It has been delayed by 2 weeks.
Man. Well, good luck.
Wonderful. Longer winter vacation. Who says no to that?
Yeah, that's right. Well, again, thanks for being here. So, this is different because you're a professor of business analytics. Is it Tsinghua University? Am I pronouncing that anywhere near correct?
It's Tsinghua. You can think of it as a CH. Yeah.
So, business is not your background, but I understand that you came to it through statistics. And of course, statistics is why I'm speaking with you today. So you've written a bunch of books about time series forecasting, data mining for business analytics, information quality, and I could go on. And from what I understand, your introduction to writing textbooks, you had found this software that you wanted to use, but there wasn't a guide for it. You didn't really know how to use it. You didn't have anything to guide you. So you ended up writing the textbook for people to use the software. Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of right. I mean, I was an assistant professor at the time, and I inherited a course in kind of advanced statistics that I was converting into a data mining course. It was one of the earliest data mining courses in business schools. And I did not know about data mining much myself. So I was kind of moving in the direction myself. And I needed to teach business students, MBAs. And MBAs can't read the computer science books. Mm-hmm. So there were lots of books, except they were not readable to the audience that I was supposed to be teaching. So yeah, I ended up teaming up with a couple of people. One person who created a software that was an add-on to Excel, which means the MBAs could work with it. And the other one was also helping with writing cases. And the three of us sat together and wrote the textbook. And the textbook has evolved over the years. We just came out with a Python edition recently.
Yeah, you have like 17 editions in different programming languages.
Well, yeah, that was based on demand, although I was not always happy with it. But that's kind of how the world moves, right? I mean, it takes turns and things happen and you have to adapt. So yeah, that's how things work.
I mean, so part of the reason why I do this podcast is I'm a big fan of podcasts, but I mean, in general, I was kind of disappointed with the fairly superficial level of scope of science podcasts that existed. You know, they're geared toward the broadest audience possible, but I wanted more depth. So I basically created what I wanted in creating the show. I'm kind of wondering, what the process of needing a textbook and so just going out and creating it, what has that taught you about yourself and or just about your kind of work?
I guess, it started a little earlier when I moved out of, so I studied at the Technion, and that's an engineering school in Israel. And then I was in a statistics department at Carnegie Mellon for 2 years as a visiting assistant professor. But once I moved out of those two places, I moved into business schools. And when you move into a business school, you face this really big, different kind of expectation in both of your students and your colleagues to explain really complicated stuff in simple ways. Mm-hmm. So a textbook is kind of like that, because you have to take really complicated ideas and simmer them down to really just the essence, the main important things. And those principles are what you need to disseminate or teach or discuss. All the technicalities, taking layers off of things it's a hard thing to do, but I think for me, it's been one of the best things because you figure out what really matters.
Yeah.
So that's the process.
It's the process of writing fiction and nonfiction. From what I understand, it's just kill your babies is the whole idea, right?
I wouldn't know about writing fiction. I'm terrible. When I have to come up with, when my daughter was young and I had to come up with, stories before bed and make them up, that would be like the most terrifying moment, much worse than writing the next chapter in the textbook. So
yeah, I've had my off nights there as well. So, okay, well, let's get into this. So I'm just going to lay out the situation here and you're not an expert in deep learning or neuroscience or anything. So, I'm really fortunate that you
Absolutely.
are stepping out of your own ocean of expertise here and joining me on the show. So we want to understand intelligence. We want to understand how it works. we have these deep learning models that perform cognitive tasks well. So you can have a model perform a task like a categorization task. And it turns out when they're performing the task well, if you set them up the right way, they predict neural data well. But now we're faced with the task of understanding the model to help understand our brains. And so the whole goal is to use these models to help us understand our brains that are these models are very loosely based on. So there are a lot of different goals in neuroscience, and there are a lot of different questions that you can use neural networks to ask, as you know. But an overarching goal is really to understand the nature of the complex processing within the neural circuits that give rise to our minds, our thoughts. You know, we want to understand, we want insight, we want it to feel like we know. And I've actually seen you giving a tutorial on neural networks for the purpose of forecasting financial data, for instance. And you're there, you're explaining how it works and, you know, what you get from the neural network. And then you point to the parameters, which are the connection weights between the units. And you actually say, these are not very useful or interpretable. What we care about more is the performance. So it's not your goal in forecasting in that respect to explain, to understand what the parameters mean, what the models, how the model is doing its function, right? Okay, so that was a long preamble, so I apologize. But now deep learning in general has infiltrated a large part of neuroscience. So, you know, whether it's using these neural networks as models of brain networks, like I was just talking about, or using them as tools of analysis. The frequent trope these days is that deep learning is basically just statistics on steroids. And then usually someone says that, and then it's followed up by the notion that what we really need is to build causality into the models. So my knowledge of deep learning is really within the neuroscience world and within the AI world. And so I really have no idea how it's used in, you know, the financial sector and in the, you know, statistical business analytics world. I mean, has deep learning affected the stats community at all?
Okay, so I think you have to really separate between industry and academia.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
This is like deep learning is, I think, you know, kind of, if you're talking about discrimination and, you know, categorizing, it's a totally different story in both places. Mm-hmm. If you're looking in industry, then obviously it's had some really magnificent successes, you know, in anything from natural language processing, you know, image recognition. Those are proven. I mean, things got better once they started using these models and the data, of course, that they'd rely on.
Yeah.
When you look in academia, I think the story is a little bit different. So I'm talking about, you asked me about statisticians. So let me also explain that I am probably not a typical statistician in the sense that I don't attend statistics conferences, the main ones. I don't go to those. I'm not part of the mainstream community. The data mining or business school type of statisticians, data scientists, wherever you want to call us, we kind of go to other places. So, for example, I work very closely in the field of information systems. So I will go to some major information systems conferences that are more around data science, so the more technical ones. I publish in those kinds of journals. You know, I'll be more integrated with people in marketing and in again, information systems management. So what you're hearing from me about statistics might not be representative if you speak to a mainstream statistician. But what I do see is the following. Usually in the field of statistics, and I read journals, I read papers, of course. The majority of statisticians will see something like this and say, that's just a fad. The computer scientists are playing whatever they're doing. We already invented it. It's kind of just a special case of, you know, it's just, you know, non-parametric stuff. Okay, that's a lot of them will say that. But then you have a very small and growing group, actually. Now they're actually much bigger, like people in Stanford who did a lot of work on studying machine learning from a statistical point of view and actually enlightening a lot of the mystery that the CS people, the computer science people, you know, just said, it works here, it's working. We have no idea why, but it's working. But these statisticians kind of broke it apart and were able to figure out a lot of properties. And there are papers coming out of people like that in that group. So if you search journals in statistics, the top journals, you will find here and there some papers like that. But that's far from mainstream. Okay, so it's even statistics is a very fragmented kind of area. And then what I'm seeing is both in the types of conferences that I go to, and also I saw in the last joint statistics meeting, the big meeting, they do have something like a workshop dedicated to deep learning, because I'm sure a lot of people are curious about what it is. And then they'll bring someone. So I saw for JSM, for the statistics meeting, they brought someone from Amazon to come and explain how it works. In the big conference that I went to, when was this? Maybe 2 years ago, they had a faculty who that was his expertise, and he did like a few hours workshop with hands-on and stuff like that. So there is interest. People want to know what it is. I don't think that a lot of them are using it. This is not like something that people will go and keep developing it. There's a small niche of people who will, but the majority won't. What I also see is, and I said this is a big divide between academia and industry, is that in order to run these models, you really have to have access to the enormous data sets.
Yeah, but those are everywhere now.
Not really.
Okay.
Not really. The type of data that Google and Amazon and Microsoft, have, is not what we have in academia, not statisticians.
Oh, right.
Okay. You might be thinking about the computer science people, but also I'll tell you another thing. A lot of the data that's out there, that's collected Wild West style by the big companies, we academics are actually not allowed to do it.
Right.
Without going through ethics committees.
Yeah, those ethics, they get in the way, don't they?
No, they should be there, and they should be regulated as well in industry.
Yeah.
But I think that's another thing. And the third thing is, statisticians tend to work, applied statisticians work with other people who have data. They don't go and collect their own data.
Right.
So maybe if they're working with a neuroscientist, they will have access to your data, but they won't go and collect the data on their own, usually. Okay. If they need to create data, they'll simulate data. That's like the statistician approach to things.
Uh-huh. And did I make a mistake by even saying statistician? Isn't it data scientist now?
You know what? You can name me any name. It doesn't matter as long as you're happy to talk to me. Years ago when you'd meet new people and say, "Oh, what do you do? What's your field?" It's like statistics. Like, "Oh, yes, we had this terrible course in statistics. I suffered so much. You're probably so smart."
Yeah. Oh, you're probably so smart and I don't want to hang out with you.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, I don't really care, but to be very honest with you, I've living in a business school makes you look at things, I think, from a higher, like a big picture kind of thing. So it's not so much the nitty gritty of doing things, but it's how do you solve problems with these methods. And that makes you more of, a problem solver that's open to lots of different methodologies and looks around for just good tools. It's kind of like an engineering mindset in a sense.
Yeah. Well, see, there's this divide, and it can all be in academia, but there's this divide sort of between AI and neuroscience, in that AI tends to be, or can afford to be more engineering-like in their approach and just build something that works. And if it works, that's great. And it doesn't matter how it works, if it accomplishes the task. Whereas on the neuroscience side, we actually want to understand how, and we want an explanation, not just a prediction. And we'll get into this difference between explanation and prediction in a few minutes here.
It's interesting. You mentioned the word how. I think the type of question that you ask is really fundamentally different, and it's not so obvious. I mean, for example, because I know nothing much about neuroscience beyond, popular books, there's kind of different kinds of explanation. So when you're saying, we're trying to understand how, you also have other kinds of questions, which is that we're trying to understand why. And then sometimes you have questions, especially in industry, is like they just want to know what causes that, or if I do this, what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen? And then you have the whole world now of deploying these decision-making algorithms where people want explainable predictions. It's like, why did it generate this prediction? And all these different questions are actually totally different. And they call for completely different ways of modeling and thinking about the problem. So when you set up the neuroscience context for me and you said, we want to understand how things are working, it's still not specific enough for me to be able to say, oh, so this kind of modeling is what you want to do. I'd have to drill down a lot more to get you to give me the type of the narrow question that you want.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to keep it as broad as possible because there are so many different types of questions and in different sectors, and there are how and why questions.
Okay.
Who knows what we'll actually get to and what kind of progress we'll make here. But I suppose one eventual situation is that we have this model that perfectly predicts brain activity, but we don't understand how the model works, right? So we can recapitulate brains down to the level of the activity of individual neurons, let's say. But then when we step back and look at it on the whole, let's say it's performing some task, like it's, turning a robot turning a screw on a line or putting a car together or something like that. But we don't understand how it's doing it. So we haven't actually, so in that sense, we have made a perfectly predictive model, but we haven't made a model that explains how it is functioning. So I guess what we really want, or at least what I want, is a model that has explanatory power, and then beyond that actually is interpretable for me to understand.
Yeah, that's the dream, right?
That's the dream.
So I guess, look, if you're able to create like an incredible predictive model, I think it has a lot of scientific value. And actually, it's kind of funny. Probably, a lot of people know my to explain or predict paper, but it actually has a sister paper that's in a different journal, and that fewer people know about because it belongs to it's an information systems journal called MIS Quarterly. And that one is called something like predictive analytics for...
It's called Predictive Analytics in Information
Systems Research. That's right. Now, you can actually, to be very honest, you can scratch out information systems and just put in predictive analytics in scientific research. But this was kind of geared with examples towards information systems. And what we do there is we talk about how you can use prediction for scientific research improvement. So not just for utility like companies, right? And what you just gave me an example of is I am able to create this amazing predictive machine. It predicts very well the phenomenon that I'm interested in studying in terms of causality, but I don't know anything about it. What have you just created for yourself? You've created an amazing benchmark. Now, any explanatory models that you have that are competing theories that you have, you can actually see how well they're doing, where they're doing better and where they're doing worse, because you know what the prediction thing, how well that prediction optimal system is working. Having this benchmark, I think, is amazing. I can't even imagine if you had something like this in lots of fields, medicine. I mean, think about what it would mean. It would be really useful.
That's sort of where we are with in neuroscience. There are, the most well-known example is you set up a deep learning net, and compared to any other model, it predicts neuronal activity in the visual cortex in this hierarchical visual system that we know about in brains better than any model that's ever come before it. So we do have that benchmark, which is how the field is progressing. And so other domains are kind of following along in this same vein.
Right. And I guess, of course, I mean, the question of causality is a super important one. And I mean, Judea Pearl has finally made enough noise that people are hearing about it in lots of fields.
Yeah.
But these questions about, why are things happening and what happens if you start changing and manipulating stuff? Because at the end of the day, those are the you don't just want to know for knowing, right? You want to know so that you can start controlling.
Sure.
Let's be honest, everything's about control at the end. We're humans. So in order to control, you really need to be able to know what knobs to turn. And when you turn them, what is going to happen and what will happen if you don't turn them, right? The counterfactual questions. So that is going to play an important role. But sticking only with prediction, it's interesting. The Explain Predict came out in 2010. That's 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the world has so dramatically changed in these 10 years. Back then, industry was not doing any prediction. It was super rare.
It was big data yet? I don't even know.
No, there wasn't the word big data.
Okay.
There was no word analytics yet. I mean, business intelligence, I think, was kind of the hot word.
Okay.
So industry was not really doing prediction because, folks in industry were studying statistics and learning how to do t-tests. That's kind of and regression models with hypothesis tests. And then finally, data mining started kicking into business. And that's when everything changed. So now all of a sudden, industry is doing massive prediction on everything without caring why or how.
Right.
They do care about what. So they do a lot of A/B tests, right? It's like, oh, if we change the color of the like button from blue to light blue, is it going to make more money or not? So they care about that, but they don't care about why and, what are the implications and what's the whole system that's down there. So industry has turned completely 180 degrees. Academia, I think, has been kind of slow to change, but it depends on the field. So I guess in neuroscience, because the neural nets kind of reminds people of the brain, they feel comfortable with something that has all these nodes and layers. I guess that's why maybe it's, I don't know, you know better than me, it's acceptable. It's less acceptable in other places. Although I do see many colleagues now, for example, you go to conferences, you read papers, and they will, just as a convenience, kind of start using image tagging with neural nets. So instead of before, maybe they had Amazon Mechanical Turkers doing the stuff for them. It's like, okay, and now we just we did a little bit and we labeled all the rest using deep neural nets. So people use it as a convenience. It's like, oh, we have a new powerful new button on our software. But it's not really, at least again, social science kind of behavioral scientists. I haven't seen them using it for trying to really mimic the whole system. It does pieces. Yeah. I should say, I mean, there are small efforts to try and use deep learning for modeling behavioral data. And I'm not talking about neural, I'm talking about, behavior as in, whether it's online behavior
purchasing
or anything like that.
Okay.
It could, exactly.
Clicking,
purchasing,
click rates,
searching. Yeah, a lot of it is online. Because we have data, right? Or companies have data online. And again, I can tell you in academia and in the work that I've seen, and I've sat on some PhD dissertations, and I'm involved in some collaborations with EE colleagues. The behavioral data is a lot trickier, and I don't yet see much promise or results with a deep learning compared to just framing your problems appropriately and getting your data into the right shape and thinking about what makes sense and what doesn't, and then just using models, machine learning models that are more reasonable, simpler, and should we call them efficient and environmentally more friendly, meaning not consuming enormous amounts of power and software, and scientifically open. We know what the algorithms are, well, kind of open because we're always using someone else's software. So yes.
Okay, well, so you already mentioned your, to explain or predict in the sister paper, the predictive analytics in research paper. So you've given lots of talks about this prediction versus explanation, and whether you like it or not, this is sort of, made you well known. I don't know. Do you feel well known from it? This is how you get invited to a lot of places, I think. And
well, it's kind of interesting. I'm always pretty shocked at where this paper has reached. I get emails, I guess, on a regular basis from fields that I have not even imagined.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to see how they said, oh, wow, we've never thought about this before, but in our field, we typically only do this and that. And people have used this paper to try and write editorials into their field. And so it's really, really interesting to see this. And then also what's nice about it is all of a sudden I'll get an email from someone saying, yeah, I read your paper, and there's also this other interesting paper that came out, in 2007. What do you think about this one? And I haven't seen that paper.
Of course not.
It's like, oh, thank you very much. Yes, no, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm also getting introduced to relevant stuff that's happening in other fields where people are beginning to do the explain predict. And I find that very interesting. Yeah, you're right. I give a lot of talks about this because I think it's important because people find it interesting in almost every field, which is kind of shocking, but that's why I wrote that paper. And I think it's definitely not the end. And there's a lot of things that evolved since I wrote that paper and that I learned that I'm still learning. I've also started playing with all kinds of crazy stuff since then.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the fun of once you realize that there's this big difference between things, you can play on both sides. You can take the machine learning stuff and see what kind of useful things you can do in the causal world with them, which is really interesting. So, I have a few interesting papers that I did with colleagues on trying to use mostly trees, which are this amazing tool. Forget neural nets. Well. Yeah. Amazing. Yes. Yeah. But using them for causality, things like identifying Simpson's paradoxes in large databases, that would totally change your recommendations. It means the whole causal direction flips when you break down the data by something. Or it's just an amazing tool. So it's kind of taking the machine learning tool and seeing what you can do with it in order to enhance causal work. And then you're playing also the other game, which is kind of really interesting, is taking these models that are they're kind of by design for causal modeling, things like structural equation models that are very heavily used in marketing, in behavioral world, where it's basically, if you know Judea Pearl's arrows, nodes and arrows, the arrows mean causal stuff. So people in these behavioral fields start from that. And then all their modeling is just geared towards testing causal hypotheses. And then we're taking those models and say, can you actually use them to generate predictions? Because if you're going to build any kind of models, you want them to have an ability to generate predictions so that you can even test their relevance and see how they're doing. So it's kind of an interesting thing to play both sides and see. They don't really meet, but it's just, you learn different things. Well,
so we're on the heels here. I will have just released an episode with Lori Hasson, which is how I became aware of you, from a reference from one of his papers recently that talks about the use of deep learning networks as models in neuroscience. And he came to this realization that in understanding brains and minds, we have this tacit assumption that what the brain is doing is building an explanatory model of the world that it's perceiving. But what deep neural networks do really well is they're not building models. They're just predicting really well. And what he calls direct fitting. So, in modeling, you can underfit if you have like huge bias, right? And so you're not explaining the data very well. Then you can overfit so that your fit goes through all of the data points and all the noise, and then you give it new data and it can't predict anything well. And his idea is that what neural networks are doing and what brains are likely, maybe his suggestion is that brains are doing the same thing, is direct fitting, because the model, our brains and the deep learning networks are over parameterized, so they're able to handle all of this predictive ability and basically directly fit all of the data. And then when there's a new data point, they have the capability not to have to use a model that it's generated for the underlying data, but just to, by dint of its over-parameterization, interpolate to that new data point, and it will fit it well. I'm not sure if I explained that well enough. And did you look at that paper that I sent you by chance?
I did, and it's a very well written paper, although it's kind of something that I have to think about very deeply. But I mean, there are a few things there that kind of raised interesting questions in my mind. So I think, first of all, it's a very interesting paper, and when a paper kind of makes you think and ask questions, that's already like a good paper for me.
Yeah, me too.
So there are a few things about it. First of all, the notion of overfitting, and there's a very nice graphic in that paper showing the underfitting and the overfitting, and then the, what is it called? The exact fitting, direct fitting.
Fit, yeah.
But what struck me there was that the direct fit curve, and maybe that's just, not really what's happening. It also kind of goes through all the data points.
Yeah.
So we would call that an overfit as well,
yeah.
Except that you have some kind of a requirement or that's what we do in regularization, right? So that the polynomial there was not going up and down as crazy. It was almost like linearly interpolating the points, almost. So it was more of like a space where you limit it. You say you can't go crazy with your polynomials, but you can still go through the points. If you're doing that, it means that you're assuming that your measurements have no error. There's nothing else. Your points are the points. So where are you allowing for the error? And that kind of the question that comes to my mind is, where is your uncertainty coming from? Is it that different brains will have different points for the same, inputs? Or do you not care about different brains because you assume all the brains are the same and they're all functioning in the same way. So there's no variability. So I'm not sure where the variability is coming in, but I'm not seeing it in the direct fit. And again, maybe it's just because I'm focusing too much on that image.
Yeah.
From what I read, they're just basically saying, let's just regularize. And regularization is, yeah, sure. I mean, we do that all the time. And it's usually very useful when you're building predictive models. It's useful when you're building descriptive models. It's not useful when you're building explanatory models. That's kind of defeating your purpose.
That's kind of the point, is that these are just really great predictive models. And the images that you're referring to, I mean, I think they are schematic, because even in individual brains, it's known there's a lot of variability within the way that neurons operate. So I imagine that those perfect fits with the lots of squiggles is just a schematic to show that it can work ideally like that.
Okay. The other thing that it brought to mind, I shouldn't say that, right? It brought to mind is at the time when I did a lot of work on online auctions, we were looking at data coming in from an online auction, and we were trying to predict, in real time, if the price is here, what is it going to be at the end of the 7-day eBay auction or something? And we had, tons of auctions, and we were trying to fit curves basically to the price. So the price from the start till the end of the auction, where you just have the beginning and you have examples of other prices that you had before. And what we did was we basically ended up using a non-parametric function. We use this, it's a field called functional data analysis in statistics, which of course is messing up with neuroscience, because for you, functional data means something else. But functional data analysis is just a field in statistics that uses these, it treats, instead of using vectors as objects, you're using anything that you want. It could be any kind of functionals. So we ended up using those things, and they're non-parametric. So again, you can say they're over-parameterized. You could think of splines, basically. Mm-hmm. But we knew that prices in auctions can only go up. They can't go down. The price cannot go down. So we constrained them. So by putting a constraint, we only had a set of these kinds of models. So they're still very flexible. There's so many ways they can capture the data, but they're limited by some domain knowledge that we know about the problem.
Right.
And I think the same thing, if that's what you want to do, constrain these neural nets by saying, look, but some things we know cannot happen. That's one thing. I think the Hassan paper is not doing that. They're saying just regularize it. Let the data control things. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm not an expert on any of this. It's just my questions that came up to mind.
Oh, that's great, though. Well, okay. I mean, like I said, you've given so many talks about this, but let's talk about prediction and explanation to be crystal clear here. So these days, so models. If you don't have a model these days, you're not doing science. And in general, I mean, all of this is up in the air, but in general, models are broken down into 3 types: descriptive, explanatory, and predictive. And I had not thought of this, but you have pointed out that statistics is mostly concerned with and using descriptive models. So what are descriptive models, and why has stats mostly dealt with them?
Okay, so descriptive models, they're defined by their goal. Okay, so when we say descriptive, it means that your goal is to represent in some parsimonious, useful way a relationship between an output and a bunch of inputs. Okay, that's what I'm trying to do. Correlation-wise, okay, I just want to find out, what's the correlation structure between inputs and an output of interest. Why do I want to do that? I have the sample, and then I want to test this correlation in a larger population. And that's where statistics basically, that's one big field of statistics. So there's so many problems that arise, little technical problems about how do you generalize from this kind of sample. And you can fit lots of little representations, descriptive models. How do those generalize, and what can you say about them? And if you went through a process of variable selection, does that change the way you have to do your inference? They're just endless questions. It's a rabbit hole. It's a rabbit hole for a whole field. And that's why there's been so much work on this in statistics. There's so many descriptive models. Even if you think of a histogram, when you're plotting your data, what is it? It's a descriptive model, but it's a model. Right. You choose your bins, it's a model.
You're speaking to it. Yeah, you're speaking right directly to my heart as a neuroscientist. So with the histogram.
There you go. So really the field has been mostly about description. Again, prediction is relatively new, but things are changing. Now there's more things happening with prediction because it's useful, because it's hot, because there's funding, because there's tools, because whatever. Explaining has been a very rocky thing in statistics. And when I say explaining, I'm talking about causal explanation. You change something and what happens to the outcome. In statistics, the majority of, well, let's say this, most statisticians will tell you you're only allowed to infer causality if you're running a randomized experiment, like a clinical trial. That's the only way you can infer causality. Everything else, forget it. Econometricians are more reasonable. They have a whole toolkit of saying, look, you can't always do experiments. We have all these, we could do quasi experiments or observational data, which is kind of similar. And then we have this whole toolkit of really interesting ways to try and tease out causality. It's very interesting, I have not known about those tools until, I'm really ashamed to say this, maybe 10 years ago. And I'm a statistician.
I thought they were pretty recent, though, are they not?
No, they've been around for a long time.
Okay.
And I remember actually when I was at University of Maryland in 2002, a little later than that, I was asked to teach some kind of a course on advanced statistics, and I looked at the topics and it had all these things in there, and I said, I have no idea what these models are. I'm not teaching this. Someone else take this course. It's not for me. And it was all econ stuff. It was all econometrics, but it's actually amazingly interesting and intricate and beautiful. And I think when you're seeing now some of the wars on Twitter or over journals with, someone writes a paper and then there's a rejoinder and then there's a response to the rejoinder and a response to the response. I've seen things like that before. It's when these clashes happen between the stats approach, the econ approach, and Judea Pearl's new approach to identifying things. So there's a whole set of toolkits now that are more visible. And I think those are really the explain part of things. And that's not something that was done in statistics, because again, in statistics, explaining causal explanation was only the world of experiments. And that's a very elaborate world that's geared towards more industrial type of experiments. There's the world of clinical trials, which is a small part of it. There's a much bigger part of the academic statistician body in the world of industrial statistics and quality control that developed lots of methods for how to experiment, how to set it up, and how many factors and how do you test for the different effects. So the worlds are so separate that's why you don't really get this mix. And until I stepped out of the world of statistics, and I came out of industrial statistics, actually, that was my PhD. So once I stepped out of there and I moved into a business school, and my colleagues were behavioral people and like all kinds of interesting backgrounds and econometricians, and I was looking at them, I had no idea what they were doing. Really, I was shocked. So sometimes you have the reaction of, I'm not teaching that course, take it away from me. But sometimes you're just going in there and saying, hey, can you tell me why you're doing that? And how are you thinking about this? And for them, it's so natural that they don't understand why you don't understand it. So it takes a long kind of working together and figuring out and trust to start seeing that these are really different things. Everyone's seeing the world in a different way and developing tools to try and answer their questions. And I think that's why when you're talking about neuroscience and, what's going to work better, it's like you have to define your question so specific. What exactly do you want to answer here? And then see what kind of tools are available in different fields to answering that.
I mean, I know if you look into the history of explanation, explanation and prediction have had this interesting relationship in the history of philosophy of science, at least. And you point out in your talks, there was a time when they were considered the same thing, prediction and explanation. And then they split, and they've been bouncing around ever since. So how did explanation and prediction come to be appreciated as distinct? I mean, this is going back to the late 1940s, I know.
Actually, the philosophy of science is interesting because they were not looking at data at all. What they were looking at was logic structure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So if you say something, what does it mean? Right. And in the early times, I mean, the 40s, there was really, like you said, there was this understanding that they're the same thing. They have the same logical structure. There's no difference between explanation and prediction. And their explanation for them, again, it's a logic structure. There's no data here. We're not talking about data. And then they had all this back and forth debating over journals. You can actually see the papers going on for 10 years. And then finally, there's a nice paper by Helmer and Rescher in 1959 where they say it becomes pertinent to investigate the possibilities of predictive procedures autonomous of those used for explanation. So they finally say you should dedicate some separate space for these two things. Let's just explore them separately. And then again, debate. And there's a really beautiful book in 1969 that came out by Dubin. It's called Theory Building. And again, still we're talking about philosophy of science. And this is where the first time he says theories of social and human behavior. Notice that he's talking about social and human behavior. That's, I think, the most interesting part of it. They address themselves to two distinct goals of science. One is prediction and two is understanding.
And he meant explanation is understanding.
Yes.
Which has come to be, those are distinct now too. But
yes, exactly. And I think the fact that they're recognizing that they're both goals of science is really a tricky part, because, I also wrote in my paper and I asked people, and I was trying to figure out what is going on here. Why have we not inherited some of this into the world of statistics? And you see that this notion that prediction is just for utility. Oh, it's very useful. We can make money out of it. We can create a product out of it. But explaining is the science. That notion is very deeply ingrained into lots of minds. And I remember I used to have pretty fierce discussions with an econometrician colleague from NYU. And at first he used to tell me, no. If you understand how things work, you should be able to predict them. And you can't predict them if you don't understand. And he's totally changed his mind, by the way, in the last 10 years. But this notion that scientific knowledge is, on a pedestal. If you understand how things work, that's what we're trying to achieve. We don't really care about prediction. Prediction is just to utilize it, to make money out of it. I don't agree with that. And as I said, industry is also doing all these A/B tests because they're trying to figure out what works. They don't necessarily care about the why. Unfortunately, that's because it's a broken way. They don't maybe care about the how, but they do care about the what. Mm-hmm. And definitely, I think in a lot of fields where we're finally seeing a little bit of progress, that, I think fields that were stuck for a long time, fields that were using data to advance their theories and were only doing explaining stuff, they were stuck so hard. Bringing prediction in actually brings some new ways of thought and breaking some old themes that were there and were maybe not supposed to be there. So yeah, I think that has changed a lot. So it starts a long time in philosophy of science. And what I did was kind of translate it into the world of data and modeling. Yeah. And it wasn't just me, it was this really enormous effort. When I was on sabbatical in 2008 and 9, it was like a half year here, half year there. I gave this talk. I don't know how many times. It was before I wrote the paper. And I gave it all over the world. I mean, I gave it, except for Africa, I think on every continent. And I got feedback. Every place I gave it to, it was some were statisticians, some were non-statisticians. It was a mix of audiences. And every place I gave it to, I got some interesting part of it that would come from people that said, oh, in our field, we find this. And I would go and search it up and they would give me some references. So the paper at the end is actually not just my paper. It's a paper that brings together lots of thoughts from people who, heard about this and discussed with me and gave me inputs and gave me thoughts. And that's, I think, what makes it so interesting.
What made you give a tour, giving this talk before you wrote the paper?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think the first talk I ever gave on it, I probably gave a seminar just like within my department.
So you'd formed some sort of core vague ideas, and well, not vague. It can't be vague if you're going to give a talk, but
it's a very good question. This is like a human memory. I don't remember how it all really. Sure. I think here's how it started. Okay, I think when I was writing that textbook, we started from some notes our co-author Nitin Patel had. He was teaching a course at MIT, and in his notes there was a chapter on linear regression, and it had a few bullets at the beginning, and it had some weird bullets that said something like, if you're using the regression for prediction, you don't have to do this and that, or this doesn't matter. And I looked at this and I said, what is this? And that was the start of the doubt in my mind. I think that's what started it, but yeah, that's sure. My reconstruction. And then I started developing it. And finally, I gave like a little informal talks with some thoughts, some of these things that I knew that you were doing differently this way and that way and why. And I was slowly building it up. And I gave a talk at it's called the CIST. It's a workshop of more like the data type of things in information systems. And it was very raw, but it won the best paper. And I knew something was there, but sometimes it's very hard to articulate things. Again, I don't come out of the humanities. I don't write so well non-technical stuff. And I knew there was something there, and I knew that I needed to get more feedback. And I knew that I just touched on something that was like something was much bigger was hiding there. And that's why I went on the tour to give talks, because every talk that I gave, every interaction that I had was like eyes were popping up, and I was either getting very antagonistic reactions or very heated. Oh, yes, exactly. Yes. This is what we're finding here and there. And I was hearing this from people who I admired and, were like the icons in their field. I remember going to Arizona State University, and Doug Montgomery, who's like a huge icon in industrial statistics and in experiments. He said to me, yes, this is why response surface methodology does things that are different from, design of experiments. And he was enlightening me to things that I knew about, but I never connected them to the explain predict. So that's why I did the huge tour. And I think that doing these tours is extremely useful if you can get good feedback. If you get to the right audiences, taking an idea that's a little out there and not the standard thing helps you take it in a long way. And since then, I've tried to do that with all my crazy ideas. It's a good approach for me.
What's better, antagonistic feedback or confirmatory feedback?
The combination.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Yeah.
Then you're onto something.
Well done. Well, let's get back a little bit to just prediction versus explanation. So we talked a little bit about the history of explanation and prediction developing into a separate goal, a separate entity than explanation. And this pair of papers that you're referring to, 2010, 2011, they really make the case, or they made the case back then really for prediction being a valuable goal in itself. And you talk about different ways in which prediction can function in science. If it's okay, can we just walk through a few of those that, come to your mind and talk about them?
Sure. So, first, from my own experience of delving a little bit with predictive models in those early days, I found that, especially as you're moving into fields that are either the field is new or else there's something new happening in the field. For example, when I was working on the online auction stuff, online auctions were relatively new in the early 2000s. Right. eBay started in, I think, 1999 or 19 something. So auctions all of a sudden moved online, and everything changed because behaviors online are totally different than in an auction room. And now you're taking all the theories from game theory about auctions and you're saying, oh yeah, that applies online as well. How do you know that, right? So when you're building predictive models, you're trying to predict prices or whatever it is, you're able sometimes to find out things that the original theories did not think about. Because how do you generate the original theories? How do theories come into place? There's a lot of domain knowledge coming in that people formulate, and then over time they finesse it and test it and finesse it and test it, but it gets stuck in a certain structure that you can't totally break. Nothing is going to give it a big whack unless you build in a predictive model that says, hey, I can predict so much better than your current theory. So generating new theory is one very useful thing to use predictive models for in a field where there's really nothing much.
In the case of the online auction thing, was it just, you take the predictive model from the, I picture the cowboy hat and the quick talking gentleman, the present auction. What do you call that? It's just an auction. That's just an auction, isn't it?
Yeah, just the ongoing auction.
Yeah, as opposed to an online auction. It would be an offline auction. Yeah, an offline auction. Yes. Okay. So you take a predictive model that works well with the offline auction, and you just slap it on and expect it to work with the online auction. But it sort of breaks, right? And is that so? That's how you generate the new theories to determine how it broke.
You could do that, or you can also, in parallel, you can develop predictive models on the online auctions and show that they're predicting much better than the other ones. Yeah. And now you're all of a sudden maybe accounting for, other stuff that's happening in the online auction that's not part of game theory, and say that's actually a very important piece of how humans are reacting to this thing that's not built into the old theories.
I see.
So that would be one example. Another really useful thing to do, especially in social sciences, where measurement is a serious problem, right? We're all building models that are around constructs, around these abstractions. When we say that something is increasing your satisfaction or your engagement, what does that mean? You have to measure it somehow.
Yeah.
So this measurement level where you're operationalizing something abstract into something measurable is basically the whole field of psychometrics. And it's a really difficult field. And I'm always shocked at how people think it's so easy to just create a survey and send it out. When I teach my research methods course to the PhD students, they somehow have a notion that it's really easy. Even after my course, when I tell them, don't do it. And here's why. I still get, we get this all the time, but it's really hard to get to design good measures. When you're doing prediction, everything is just at the measurement level. Nobody cares about constructs. So if you have a bunch of different measures that you're considering to use for a construct, and some of them predict much better when you put it in your model. Let's say you want to, again, let's say satisfaction, and you can measure it by a person's self-reported satisfaction level on a scale of 1 to 10, or by their neural behavior, right, that you're measuring, or by how often they're smiling on the video, or whatever it is. You have all these different measures, and you find that some of these have much better predictive power. It helps you design better measures. So again, this is kind of using the predictive theory to try and help you develop measures, kind of taking it back into the psychometrics.
I mean, this is related to generating new theories, it seems like.
Well, theories are at the construct level, but then you have to somehow move the theoretical thing into the world of measurement. And I think this is foreign to people who don't do social science. Because when you're doing, I'm guessing neural is like medicine. You're just measuring heart rate. Heart rate is heart rate, but you're not abstracting it as, health of the heart, right? So the minute you think in constructs and your theories are at the construct level, you have another layer, which is measurement. So that's another very useful thing where predictive models come in, is developing the measures. We talked about comparing theories. So, there are fields where you have competing theories, and they've been there for a long time, fighting in communities of researchers saying, no, this is right. No, this is right. And until you can actually generate predictions, sometimes it's very hard because both of them can explain everything.
This is big in the neuroscience world as well. So, this directly relates.
Yes. And of course, you could do things like improving theory. So a very low-hanging kind of thing to do is, when you're using predictive models and they're more flexible, a lot of times it's because they're maybe adding more interaction terms. Like if you're using trees instead of regression models, the tree is kind of looking through all the possible interactions and finding stuff for you. And interactions have a very important meaning in theory, because if you find that things interact, it can mean that one thing is moderating the other thing. It can mean that there are different ways to interpret what it means, but that can actually add to the theory itself. If you know that a certain mechanism works differently during day and night, and the predictive model picked up on the day and night and you never thought about it yourself, then that helps you develop your theory. So there's so many things. I mean, assessing predictability or evaluating how predictable this phenomenon that you're even looking at, that's fundamental. I mean, think about finance. If they would be a little more humble and test their models in terms of, is it really predictable what you're trying to predict?
They don't need to.
Exactly. So it's either you have your confidence or hubris, or you actually evaluate whether it's even predictable. Because if you tell me, look, I can predict with this model, no problem. But if you look at the prediction accuracy and you think about the practical meaning of the accuracy, it's like not practically meaningful. Then what's the whole point? What is the whole point? So you have to be honest about the predictability of what you're doing. Sometimes it doesn't matter, but at least just tell me so we know where things are.
These are so interesting. I mean, it's, as I'm looking at them, I'm thinking like how, I've got to apply this to the deep learning and neuroscience world. And so it's a lot to think about how to apply these different types of uses for prediction. So I think this is really useful. And I mean, you go through these more in depth in the paper as well. So of course I'll be pointing people to, in both papers actually. So I'll be pointing to both of those papers. You talk about different ways. I think in the paper you use 4 different ways that prediction and explanation, their difference manifests. But now I think you're up to 15 or 16. Is that? Yeah.
No. You're right in the direction, but your quantity is a little off.
Okay.
Okay. So initially, I really kind of mapped these 4 aspects. And over time, actually, it pretty quickly started hitting me, but it was too late, right? The paper was out. I realized there was a 5th one that was fundamentally a huge difference. It doesn't have to be one. This fifth dimension doesn't have to be a differentiator, but it is. And it might change later on, but here it is. So let me start from the first four.
Yeah.
The four that I talk about in the paper, these are aspects that help you distinguish, that have different weights in explanation versus in prediction. And when I'm saying explanation now, the meaning that I am referring to is the causal explanation. If X is going to happen, then if X happens, is that going to cause Y?
And by different weights, you just mean it's not a black and white binary. Explanation is related to X, whereas prediction is related to X.
Yes, exactly. So for example, the first aspect is theory versus data. And you can have a whole spectrum of how much you rely on theory versus how much you rely on data. When you're doing explanatory work, you're relying very heavily on theory. You start from theory that's built out of, domain, previous knowledge. Everything is very theory driven. And then you use the data to test your theories.
Right.
So the data is used as a helper in a sense. And if something weird is happening, you're going to say something's weird about the data. Whereas when you're doing prediction, you're a lot more heavy on the data side. And of course, you're not just closing your eyes and putting every data that you can into the story, but your theory is brought in a less formal way. It's your domain knowledge. It's kind of things, oh yeah, we know that this should be in the model. We should measure those and put them in the model, but it's less formal. So that is one aspect that will make predictive models very different from explanatory models. Your starting point is just completely different in how much theory and how much data is in there.
It's a good one to start off with because I think that the data has obviously exploded. It's changed a lot in the past 10 years, with the rise of big data. So data has maybe taken on a more important role. And do you see that as having helped the rise of predictive models in various domains, just the availability of data? Because previously, data was kind of scant, right? So you had to build an explanatory model, and you had a few data points to throw in there and see if it can confirm the model or, helped explain whether the model was correct. Whereas now we have all this data, we can just throw the data at it and see what happens. Do you see that as being a factor?
Well, first of all, of course, without the data, you can't do all the predictive stuff that's going on right now.
Sure.
So I'm sure that I absolutely agree that, having all this data right now is making prediction possible in ways that was totally not possible before, both in terms of the richness of the data and in terms of the amounts of the data. And most importantly, the fact that the data is now structured in a way, in databases, in ways that support the analytical work. Because even, years and years ago, you had telecoms and you had banks, they had tons of data, but a lot of it was not in a place that you could actually use to do the analysis.
It was on paper, in boxes.
It was in boxes. And even when it was digitized, it was in silos, right? You couldn't kind of put things together. So technology has definitely made a big difference in that. Whether theory is playing less of a role, again, you kind of have to separate what's going on in industry and what's going on in academia.
Sure.
The time frames and the deadlines and the goals in both places are completely different. And not relying on theory is a very short-term thinking. Nobody says that you have to stick with theories forever. The whole idea of science is that theories evolve and get better. But forgetting about theories, like the Wired, and saying, oh, they're useless. It's kind of cool and, Silicon Valley to say that. And I used to be very, it's very nice, but it's not long-term thinking and it's not deep thinking.
What's the Wired? You referenced the Wired?
The Wired editor who wrote about the end of theory.
End of theory? Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. That was a very famous debunking of theory. We have so much data now. There's no point. You don't need theory. No need. It's actually standing in the way, So the reason these arguments come up is because in many times people fall so much in love with a theory. A community of research is so in love with a theory that they can't see beyond their theory.
Right.
And that is a problem. But it doesn't mean that theory doesn't have value. Theory forces you to go slowly, to test it out in lots of ways, in lots of scenarios, by lots of, if it's different groups over time and different. So you have to have something there. If you're just going to move along with the data and move with the tide, Sure, but I mean, as humans, we don't really wake up in the morning and just think what's going to happen in the next minute and not care about the rest. We can't really do very well about the rest, but we care about the rest. So if we care about the rest, I think theory has a role to play.
Sounds lovely, though, to not really have to think about it.
Yes, it's easy. You can just write your code.
That's right. All right. Well, so good. So that's theory data.
So that's the first one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The second one is almost obvious. It's causation versus association. And you have this whole spectrum. And again, you have things that are more strongly causal and a little less and a little less how much confidence you have in your causality until you say, no, all I care about is just correlations. And predictive models will work just fine as long as correlations are there. They don't care about causality. Sometimes you don't need the causality. It doesn't help you to get better predictions in the short term within the context that you are, right?
Yeah.
So prediction is a very kind of context dependent animal. And if that's what you want to do, association is your friend. So all kinds of things like, statisticians love really complicated words that are long and hard to spell. So multicollinearity is like a curse word in statistics. It's where you have a bunch of inputs that are highly correlated. And when they're highly correlated, it messes up some of the standard errors and whatever. And there's like methods to detect them and to remove them. This is like, cancer. It's serious. But if you're trying to do prediction, multicollinearity doesn't really matter much. If you don't, unless you want to extrapolate beyond your input sphere, it doesn't matter. So all this extra efforts and whatever, they're kind of useless. It's not really good. So the kinds of efforts that you would put into modeling in a predictive model would be different than the type of efforts that you would put in when you're doing causal stuff. For example, here's a different thing. When you're doing causal modeling, you care very much because it's causal. The inputs have to happen before the outputs in terms of the causal chain. You have to be really careful in terms of not putting anything else that influence the inputs into the output, right? Then you get something called reverse causality. And again, econometricians are amazing at this. They're so careful at looking at each variable that they have and thinking carefully whether there's something that could have affected it in this way or the other. But when you're doing prediction, you don't care. What you care is that at the time of prediction, all those input variables are available. If those inputs are available at the time of prediction, I couldn't care less how they led to the outcome. If something else was causing both of them, I do not care. Mm-hmm. So that's why you have this really different set of decisions that you make when you're building a predictive model than a causal model. There's not one truth. It's just utilitarian. What do you want to do? Based on that, here's your path. Here are the things that you have to worry about. So that's the causation versus association. And it's kind of funny because, you have this mantra that statisticians always say, association is not causation.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Right?
They say association is not causation?
Yes.
Well,
right? Or correlation is not causation.
Okay. Yeah, we always say correlation.
Correlation is not causation. And it's true. One does not infer the other, but nobody really ever, thinks that. In disciplines where they're using correlation and making causal statements, it's usually because there's a theory that states the causal thing, and the correlation is just quantifying it. It's interesting. I just got an email last night from a medical doctor in the States asking me exactly about this. I read your paper and I'm just wondering if I'm just trying to build a descriptive model and I just care about which inputs are correlated with the outputs. Is it okay to do this and that? So, obviously the answer is always, what do you mean? Is it okay? What are you trying to do with this model at the end?
Is it okay?
Right? What is the final goal?
The patient is on the gurney right now. What should is it okay? You must get those emails all the time.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. But again, it's very interesting because it lets me see what's happening in a field and how people are thinking about it. We wrote this little paper. I did a collaboration. It's a short paper that I did with a physical therapist researcher. After we got a request from an editor to write some editorial piece, and we went through it 4 times, 4 rounds. Eventually, it didn't go anywhere. And I said, you know what? We did such an interesting piece here about using prediction for doctors, basically, what they can do if you don't know much and whatever. I just posted it, I think, on Archive. SSRN or Archive, one of them, I think on SSRN, maybe that's like it's the equivalent of the social science, because these emails, these contacts that I get, they open an important question in a field that's stuck on either explanation or prediction. And by just giving a little nugget out there of saying, here's how to get started with what you have right now. And this little collaboration, that we did, I think those are the important opportunities to actually spread the knowledge. So talks are one thing, but these emails are personalized into fields.
Yeah, but that's a lot of emails either way.
It is. It is. Some of them I can't answer.
Of course.
Yes.
Well,
okay. So we're into the second one, right? So the third one is a retrospective to prospective. That is almost intuitive once you say that, because when you're doing prediction, you're usually looking forward. Not always, but you're usually looking forward. You're trying to predict something in the future. So everything that you're doing in the modeling process has to mimic that thought. You kind of have to simulate that moment of deployment where you're going to use the model to predict. And every decision that you make will have to be based on, do I have the same information that I will have at the time of deployment? Will things change or not? Versus when you're doing explanatory or even descriptive modeling, you're looking retrospectively. You're just trying to find some kind of relationship between the outputs and inputs. And you're not necessarily going to project that into the future. You're trying to learn some kind of I don't want to use the very loaded word truth, but some kind of relationship that's useful to you. And in that sense, because it's retrospective, it allows you to do a lot more things that you cannot do in a prospective case. For example, you can use information that's known after the output happened. So again, when I go back to the online auctions example, if I wanted to predict or create a model that captures the relationship between the price and some inputs, the number of bidders is a critical input in all game theory. You know, the more bidders you have, the price goes up. But if you're looking at an eBay auction, you don't know the number of bidders until the auction's closed. Mm. So I couldn't use number of bidders as an input in a prediction model, but I'm allowed to use it as an explanatory. Because if I'm in the middle of the auction, I don't know how many bidders.
Oh, if you're in the middle of an individual auction, but you could predict on average.
Who wants an on average?
Well, yeah, that's true. It's kind of useless for that, I suppose. Yeah.
You actually just exactly hit on the fifth dimension. I mean, we skipped the fourth one, but
sure.
The fifth one that I added is exactly this: the difference between the average observation and the individual observation. So when you're doing prediction, and that's just how things are today, it doesn't have to be that way. Prediction is typically done at the individual. Mm. You're trying to personalize, right? You're trying to predict what's going to be the outcome for this person or for this transaction. So everything in prediction is geared towards individual prediction. You're using your model and you're scoring or you're deploying it to individual observations, and then you're accumulating the mistakes and tuning based on that. But everything that's done in the descriptive and explanatory world is geared towards the average observation. So on average, 3 units increase and blah, blah, blah will increase, everything there is about the average, because you're trying to learn a story about a population. And that's very different. It's totally different. And now it's, as I said, I mean, this is kind of I'm just mapping. I'm telling you, this is the normative thing of what's going on, but it doesn't have to be like that. Because even when you look inside the prediction world, and this is something that I'm just waiting for this to sort of start breaking out big. It's in little pockets. You can sometimes when you're doing prediction, it's really because the decisions that will happen based on those predictions are individualized. So if I'm predicting different outcomes for different people, I will treat them in different ways. Okay, personalized treatment. But in some cases, those predictions are not really going to lead to that. They're going to lead to just one policy change. Yes, we're going to do a monetary, let's not say things like that now, right? Let's just change a big policy. And this policy is going to affect everyone. We're going to quarantine everyone or not quarantine everyone. Maybe I build a predictive model for that, but it will be used in an aggregate way, right? Because you do have policy problems like that.
Yeah.
And the way you measure performance and the way you tweak the models should actually be totally different. Totally different. But right now we have one way of doing things in the world of prediction. It's RMSE and confusion matrices and recall and yeah. So yeah.
I mean, as you're going through these, I'm just thinking like every one of them so far. I'm thinking the deep learning and could do either of these. Could the goal of a deep learning model could be for either of these cases. So in this average versus individual case, you can see we each one of us has an individual model of our brains, and it's this big network, right, of artificial neurons all interacting. But if we really want to understand how taste works, for instance, then we wouldn't be modeling individual brains for predicting how their taste buds would react. We would model on average. We'd make a model to understand how taste works in general. So it's so much to think about. Just going down this list and thinking how, okay, you could approach it in this theory way, or you could approach it in this data way. You could approach it in the retrospective way, or the explaining, or prospective, predicting what the units are going to be doing. So I realize I'm just blathering on here, but each one of these, it's really interesting to think about how deep learning neural networks can be used in the domain of neuroscience. So there is one more. It's the bias-variance difference here.
And that's the one that most statisticians and machine learning people get most excited about.
Yeah.
And typically they think, oh yeah, that's the difference. So that's the one that's most developed theoretically. And you can write it out. You can write out equations and show that when you're doing explanation, it's all about the bias, and you care about the bias, and you'll do whatever you can. Over parameterization is less of a problem because you put in an extra thing and it's supposed to be 0. It doesn't bother you.
Right.
But when you're doing prediction, that really matters, and then the variance also matters. So you try in prediction to balance both bias and variance, whereas in explanation, it's only about the bias. In description, it's usually also this bias variance together, which is kind of interesting.
Huh.
And I think a lot of these, and again, the questions that I'm getting by emails sometimes is about model selection, variable selection, things like stepwise in regression, or lassos, or any kind of regularization where you have many inputs and you're trying to reduce them. And if you look at classic papers in econometrics, or people doing econometrics in other fields, you'll see, for example, if they do a regression model, they will run the regression model and they'll show you results of the regression model with all the inputs, with some of the inputs, with a few less. They have what they call the long regression and then shorter regressions. And as a statistician, when you look at this and you say, what? No, but they have these things that are statistically insignificant. They should remove them. This is what they teach us in statistics. It's a different approach because the inputs that they choose and leave in there, maybe they're not statistically significant, but they're theoretically supposed to be there. So they want to show me that the theory says they're supposed to be here, but look at how small they are, or look at how meaningless they are, or whatever. So this idea of bias and variance, it's you can write it out, but there's also a lot of domain level justification. You have to think about it also from a more domain point of view. The other thing that comes up with bias variance is using all kinds of regularized methods. And that's why you'll see them more being used in predictive places. So if you're using the deep learning and it has regularization on and everything, and of course it's not interpretable to start with, that makes total sense for prediction and for description. But it's not going to make any sense for explanation. Because think about it this way. Suppose you have these two inputs and both of them are measuring the construct that you really care about. But one of them is not measured as well as the other because of your measurement tools or something like that. And you're regularizing. Who's going to get dropped out? So you just lost a really important piece of information. So for prediction, it's good. Yeah, great, right? For description, you just reduce the bias variance. But from your domain point of view, you lost something useful and interesting. And that's why this trade-off of how you do variable selection and why some things work better for prediction and not well for explanation is a different, you need a different approach.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's just so much to consider. It's too much to consider, really.
Yes, I know.
One way in which it is suggested that artificial neural networks can be used is as in an exploratory mode. So, I mean, basically, if you don't have a good theory on something, you can use your model as a toy and explore throughout. And that sounds to me almost like it falls under the predictive modeling umbrella. I mean, do you see exploration itself as a valid modeling goal?
I think that, again, you have to sort of tell me what are you going to do with it? What do you mean by exploration? Are you trying to find how certain inputs correlate with a certain output, or what are you trying to do?
Yeah. So I guess in the case of deep learning models, there isn't a good theory to begin with. So I think that it would be in the service of generating hypotheses, right? So you run your model, you look at the data, maybe then you take out half the units and run the model, and you look at the data and see. But in that regime, it's basically acting as a predictive model, because then you're going to be matching the data that the model generates to the data that you recorded in a brain, for instance.
So why is that not a descriptive goal? I mean, if the end goal is to build a theory of prediction, then maybe you're predicting. But if you're just trying to find what kind of configurations, have a good, let's say, I don't know how you're measuring it, low RMSEs or whatever. Right. Yeah, then it could be just a descriptive model. It doesn't, unless you're doing holdout data and you're caring about what's happening when you're training the data on some part, you're training your model on some part and how well it works on a different part. Then it would be about out of sample and about prediction. But if you're just trying to build a model that's descriptive and you don't care so much maybe about, a prediction, it could be a descriptive. See, I mean, you mentioned my book on information quality, and this work that I did with Ron Kennett started from something very naive that's very relevant here as well. So information quality, the idea of this concept that we came up with was that whenever you're doing data analysis, there are actually 4 components going on, and they're very tightly coupled. And in order to determine how much information is available in a certain data set in order to answer your question, which is what an analysis is about, right? Mm-hmm. You have data, you've got a question, you want to answer it. You have to sort of figure out a bunch of things. So the 4 components that we have in there are, you have your goal, you have your data, you have the set of analyses that are in your world. In your case, for example, you're saying the deep learning methods, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have a utility measure, your performance measures. And in order to tell you whether, you're going to give me this data set and whether there's any information, is there any quality in the information in that data set, I need to know all these 4 things. And in order to specify all of these, there's like a checklist of questions. So when you say, I want to explore, it's like, no, you don't want to explore. What are you going to do with exploration? I'm going to take you down and pin you to the wall until I know what you want to do with this at the end. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the word exploration in itself is a modeling goal. I think it's maybe you're describing what you're planning to do, but not what is the goal.
Of course, yeah, okay, I can agree with that.
So I'm going outside in Taipei, and you're telling what's your goal, and I'm not going to say, I'm just exploring. It's like, no, I want to find new places, or I want to see people, or I want to see a place I've not seen before. So there needs to be a goal implicit. Yeah,
maybe goal was the wrong terminology to use. Maybe the means as an end would be a better way to phrase it, perhaps. I mean, in a sense, this is the way science generally really works anyway when you get down to it, is we're all exploring. And you can talk about your highfalutin theory as much as you want and the way you're going to analyze your data. But then on a day-to-day basis, often you're just in there and you're getting comfortable with the data because you have to understand the data, seeing what you can do, and then that helps you form the theory. And, it's all circular, of course, and feeds into each other.
Totally. I agree with you. And that's a whole like a gray shadow area of how we do research. We actually spend most of their time like getting familiar with the data, exploring it for sure. But that's usually not, try and publish that stuff. That's not the publishable stuff, right? Because that's your homework. So you're doing all your homework and you get to know the data set and the field really well. And actually, you're very right. I think that many times when I looked at data, that's when some weird stuff comes up and you say, hold on a second. We had no idea, maybe this whole thing that we were thinking about, that's the wrong question to ask. We should be asking a totally different question. So I think you're right. That's what actually happens. That's the engine that runs behind the scenes. But I don't think it's stated as such. I think that is really the back end. That's the backstage of what we do.
Sure.
And that's why also, data visualization. I think that's like one of the most important things you can do, much more than the modeling. You have a deep neural net, fine, everything. But if you kind of get a feel of looking at stuff and then see why things are working, that helps. And that's the part that you were saying before about our need to explain things in a language that we understand, or we think we understand.
Right, we think we understand. Well, Galit, yes. We're just about out of time. Let me ask one more question about prediction and explanation here. And so in science, there's this sort of glorified loop, right? That you have a theory, you make a model, then you do an experiment, you get the data and you test it against the model, and then you use that to tweak the model and use that to tweak the theory, and then you make a new experiment, and on and on and on. And I'm wondering if, given the difference between prediction and explanation, if you see them as accommodating this sort of back and forth. So you make this beautiful predictive model, and then you generate new hypotheses, and then you use that to make a better explanatory model. And then you can use the explanatory model to make a better predictive model, and back and forth. Is that a feasible way of going about things?
I definitely think that's probably the best way to do things. I think we're not really there. It would be really important to go there. I think that's the whole point of the paper, that I did was in order to do anything scientific, you have to have both components. If you're lacking one of them, you're just stumbling in place. So I think what you described is correct. I think that you're starting, I don't know where you start. It depends which field you're in, but you're in the loop now. And then you're building your theories up. And then you're building predictive models, and the predictive models are telling you new stuff, and you have to update your theories, and you keep going back and forth. And again, this is when we're talking about science development. We're not talking about necessarily applications. Yeah. In applications, you have also a circular thing, but it's a little bit different. But if you really want to answer the how and the why, not just the what, right? The how and the why, I think that is the circle. And in fact, if you take it back to the brain, which is your favorite organ, I think that's kind of what our brain is doing anyways. You asked me once about how the brain works. And I don't know, I'm not a neuroscientist. I can just tell you what my personal theory is right now. And that is we're creating these predictions all the time. The brain is processing what's going on, whether it's your memory, whether it's what's happening around you, it's processing and immediately creating these predictions so that you can act in the world. You can react and you can act and you can interact. But immediately, the minute you do this unconscious thing, which I think is unfortunately, it took me a long time to figure out it's unconscious. The moment it happens, you also produce an explanation of why.
Post hoc.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. So we're constantly making up these stories. Now, why we're making up these stories? I mean, they're theories. I guess you can ask different people what happens before and what, I think it's a loop as well. So you've created your story and that story adds to your memory and adds to the way you're framing things and affects your predictions. And it just keeps going on. So whether science is trying to mimic what the brain is doing because that's what we feel comfortable with, we need the explanations, we can't live without them. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Maybe we're stuck in our own head cycle, but
we can only produce the way that our brain actually works mechanically anyway, right?
Yes, maybe it's the time to ask the heavy meditators. Maybe they can free us out of the scientific, circle of death.
No, don't bother the meditators. Let them meditate.
It actually works pretty well. It's a good thing for a scientist to meditate. I can tell you that. It gives you a lot of insights as well.
Yeah. All right, Galit. Well, I really appreciate your time. I know I've taken you over a minute or two here now, but thank you for the insight. Thanks for the paper, and I wish you continued success moving forward. And hope maybe one day you'll not have to be talking about explain or predict.
Thank you very much. I hope that we'll hear a lot of interesting other podcasts coming from your side, and now maybe talking about explaining and predicting. That would be pretty interesting.
Thanks, Galit.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. You can support the show through Patreon for a microscopic $2 or $4 per month. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help sustain and improve the show and prohibit any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thanks for your support. See you next time.
We've left our heyday, searching the coffers for empty offers. I don't know why you trust the sky. Must like your life.